It was a busy afternoon at the cozy little diner on the corner of Maple Street. The clatter of dishes, the soft hum of conversation, and the comforting aroma of coffee and freshly baked pie filled the air. Everything seemed normal, just another day of people coming in and out, grabbing a bite, and sharing moments. Among the mix of regulars and newcomers was a white woman sitting at a booth by the window, tapping her fingers impatiently on the table. Her pristine handbag sat on the seat beside her, and her phone rested in her manicured hand, the screen glowing as she scrolled endlessly. She was clearly in a rush, glancing at her watch every few seconds and sighing loudly enough to make sure people nearby noticed her frustration. Her expression was sharp, her lips pursed. Every so often, she'd look around the room, as if searching for someone to come and make her day better or at least move things along faster. A menu lay in front of her, untouched. Her agitation grew more obvious with every passing minute, and soon, her annoyance bubbled over. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice cutting through the gentle hum of the diner. Heads turned. The room grew quiet for a moment before people awkwardly returned to their conversations, pretending not to notice. But it was impossible not to. Her tone carried a sharpness that lingered in the air, demanding attention. A young waiter approached her table, balancing a tray in one hand and wearing a calm, professional smile. He was tall and confident, moving with the practiced ease of someone used to dealing with all kinds of people. His uniform was crisp, and he radiated a quiet kindness that softened his otherwise serious demeanor. As he reached her table, he set the tray down on the nearby counter before turning to her. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said warmly, his voice steady and polite. "How can I help you?" The woman looked him up and down, her eyes narrowing slightly. For a moment, she said nothing, and the tension grew thick. Finally, she let out an exaggerated sigh and gestured toward her table. "I've been sitting here for 10 minutes, she snapped, her tone sharp and dismissive. "I don't have all day, you know. Do you people not believe in service?" The waiter didn't flinch. He maintained his composure, his expression calm but unreadable. "I'm sorry for the wait," he replied evenly. "We're a little short-staffed today, but I'll do my best to take care of you. Can I get you started with something to drink?" She rolled her eyes, clearly unimpressed by his response. "Water," she said curtly. "No ice. And make it quick." He nodded and turned to leave, but before he could take more than a step, she added, "And bring me a lemon wedge. Fresh, not one of those dried-out ones." "Of course," he said simply, walking away toward the kitchen. As soon as he was out of earshot, the woman muttered under her breath, shaking her head. "Unbelievable," she said, loud enough for the neighboring table to hear. "Is it so hard to find competent help these days?" The couple seated nearby exchanged uncomfortable glances but said nothing. The woman seemed entirely unaware of how her words landed, or maybe she didn't care. Either way, she sat back in her seat, crossing her arms as she stared out the window. When the waiter returned, he placed a glass of water on the table with the lemon wedge carefully balanced on the rim. "Here you go, ma'am," he said. "Are you ready to order, or do you need more time?" She didn't look up at him. Instead, she picked up the glass, inspecting it closely as though searching for a flaw. Then, after a moment, she set it back down with a clink and said, "I'll take the Cobb salad. No bacon. And make sure the dressing is on the side. I don't want it drowning in ranch like last time." He nodded, jotting down her order. "Got it. Anything else?" "No," she said flatly. "Just don't take forever with it, okay?" He nodded again, offering a small smile before stepping away. As he disappeared into the kitchen, the woman shook her head and muttered under her breath again. "Ridiculous. This place has really gone downhill." It wasn't long before the waiter returned with her salad, setting the plate down gently in front of her. "Here you are," he said, his tone as polite as ever. "If there's anything else you need, just let me know." She glanced at the plate, then back at him. For a moment, her eyes lingered on him, as though she were seeing him for the first time. There was a flicker of something in her expression, confusion. Recognition? But just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, replaced by her usual air of superiority. "That'll be all," she said, dismissing him with a wave of her hand. The woman sat frozen for a moment, her eyes fixed on the kitchen door the waiter had just walked through. Something about him had unsettled her, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. She picked up her fork and prodded at the salad in front of her. But her appetite seemed to have vanished. The sounds of the diner, the clinking of plates, the low murmur of conversations faded into the background as her mind raced. Where did she know him from? There was something familiar about his voice, his demeanor, even the way he carried himself. It was frustratingly just out of reach, like a word on the tip of her tongue that refused to come forward. She glanced around the diner, her gaze darting from table to table, wondering if anyone else had noticed something unusual. But everyone had gone back to their meals, their conversations, their lives. If they had sensed the same undercurrent she had, they didn't show it. She took a sip of her water, the lemon wedge still balanced neatly on the rim of the glass. Her hand trembled slightly as she set it back down. "Calm down," she told herself. "You're overthinking this." But the feeling of unease refused to leave her. She stared out the window, trying to shake it off. The streets outside were busy, people hurrying past on their way to wherever they needed to be. Life was moving on, as it always did. And yet she couldn't. The minutes dragged by, and her thoughts kept circling back to the waiter. She replayed the brief exchange in her head, trying to piece together why it had affected her so deeply. His face, it was familiar, wasn't it? Not just a vague familiarity, like someone you might have passed on the street once, but something more. She'd seen him before. She was sure of it. But where? The kitchen door swung open, and her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure why she felt so on edge, but there it was, an undeniable flutter of nerves as he walked back into the dining area. He wasn't carrying anything this time, just moving through the room with the same calm confidence as before. His eyes scanned the tables, checking on customers, making sure everything was in order. When his gaze briefly met hers, she quickly looked away, focusing intently on her salad as though it were the most fascinating thing in the world. But she could feel his presence, even as he moved past her table. It was like an invisible thread had been strung between them, pulling her attention toward him no matter how hard she tried to resist. She hated the feeling. It made her feel small, vulnerable, as though he held some kind of power over her. And yet, she couldn't explain why. The couple at the table next to hers spoke in hushed tones, their voices carrying just enough for her to catch snippets of their conversation. "Did you see how he smiled at her?" the woman said, her tone curious. "Yeah," the man replied. "It was different. Like he knows something." Her stomach tightened. She wasn't imagining it then. Other people had noticed too. There was something about him, something unspoken, something that hovered just beneath the surface. Unable to stop herself, she pushed her plate aside and stood up. Her chair scraped against the floor, drawing a few curious glances from nearby tables, but she didn't care. She needed answers. She made her way toward the counter, where the waiter was now standing, jotting something down on a small notepad. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. He looked up, his expression as calm and unreadable as ever. "Yes, ma'am? Is everything all right?" She hesitated, suddenly unsure of what to say. Her heart was pounding, her mouth dry. She felt foolish standing there, but the question spilled out before she could stop herself. "Have we met before?" For a moment he didn't respond. His dark eyes studied her, searching for something she couldn't name. Then, slowly, He smiled, not the polite smile of a server trying to keep a difficult customer happy, but something deeper, almost knowing. Maybe, he said simply. It's a small world, after all. His answer only frustrated her further. That's not an answer, she snapped. I'm serious. Do I know you from somewhere? He tilted his head slightly, as if considering her question. It's possible, he said after a moment. People cross paths in unexpected ways all the time. She opened her mouth to press him further, but before she could, a voice called out from across the room. Excuse me. Can I get some service over here? He glanced toward the source of the interruption, then back at her. If you'll excuse me, ma'am, he said, his tone polite but firm, I need to get back to work. And with that, he walked away, leaving her standing there, her questions unanswered. She returned to her table, her mind spinning. There was something maddeningly cryptic about his words, like he was deliberately keeping her in the dark. And yet there had been something almost kind in his expression, as though he understood her frustration but couldn't or wouldn't give her the clarity she wanted. She stayed at the diner longer than she'd intended, nursing her glass of water and occasionally picking at her salad, though she barely tasted it. She kept an eye on him as he moved through the room, interacting with other customers, his demeanor unfailingly calm and professional. But every so often, she caught him glancing in her direction, a flicker of that same knowing smile crossing his face before he turned away. By the time she finally left, the sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the street. She stepped outside, the cool evening air a welcome relief against her flushed cheeks. But as she walked toward her car, she couldn't shake the feeling that the encounter wasn't over. There was more to this story, she could feel it. And somehow, she knew it was only a matter of time before the truth revealed itself. What she didn't know was that the answer to her question, the truth about who he was, would change everything. That night, the woman couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the day's events over and over in her mind. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that the waiter was someone important, or at least, someone tied to a part of her life she'd long forgotten. Every detail about him stood out, the calm way he spoke, the piercing look in his eyes, the way his presence seemed to fill the room. And then there was his smile, that subtle, almost teasing expression that suggested he knew far more than he let on. She rolled over and grabbed her phone from the nightstand, scrolling through her social media feed mindlessly, hoping to distract herself. But even that didn't help. Her thoughts kept circling back to him. Frustrated, she sat up and swung her legs over the side of the bed, her feet touching the cool hardwood floor. "Who are you?" she muttered to the empty room. The next day, she couldn't resist the urge to return to the diner. She told herself it was just to clear her head, to prove to herself that she was overthinking everything. Maybe she'd overreacted. Maybe the waiter wasn't anyone important, just a random face in a crowd. But as she walked through the front door, the familiar sound of the bell above the entrance, and the smell of fresh coffee greeted her, and the knot in her stomach tightened. The same waitress from yesterday greeted her with a warm smile and led her to a table, but it wasn't long before she noticed the waiter again. He was standing behind the counter, refilling a coffee pot, his movements as smooth and unhurried as ever. When he turned and saw her, their eyes met briefly. This time, she didn't look away. He didn't seem surprised to see her. Instead, he gave a small nod, as though he'd been expecting her all along. It only deepened the mystery. She tried to focus on the menu in front of her, but she couldn't concentrate. The words blurred together, meaningless against the backdrop of her growing obsession. When he approached her table, the air around her seemed to shift. He stood there for a moment, waiting for her to speak, his expression unreadable. "Back again so soon?" he asked, his tone light but carrying that same hint of something deeper. She hesitated, then set the menu down. "I have questions," she said bluntly. His eyebrows lifted slightly, but he didn't seem caught off guard. About the menu? You know that's not what I mean, she replied, her voice firm. Who are you? He glanced around the diner, as if assessing the situation. The room was busy but not overly crowded, with most of the patrons absorbed in their own conversations. Still, there was a tension in the air, as though people were more aware of the interaction than they let on. I'm just a waiter, he said finally, his tone even. Here to make sure you have a pleasant dining experience. That's not true, she said, her frustration bubbling to the surface. There's something you're not telling me. I know you. I just don't know how. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice. Sometimes, he said softly, it's better to let certain questions go unanswered. She stared at him, her heart pounding. Why? What are you hiding? He straightened, his calm demeanor unshaken. Enjoy your meal, he said simply, then turned and walked away before she could say anything else. The rest of the day passed in a blur. She stayed at the diner longer than she'd planned, but the waiter kept his distance, busying himself with other tables. Every time she saw him, that same feeling of familiarity washed over her, stronger than ever. By the time she left, she was no closer to finding the answers she sought. But she wasn't ready to give up. Over the next few days, she began piecing together everything she could about the diner and its employees. She asked the waitress subtle questions about the staff, hoping to learn more about the enigmatic waiter, but the answers were vague and unhelpful. Oh, him? The waitress said one afternoon when the topic came up. He's only been here a few months. Keeps to himself, mostly. Nice guy, though. Customers love him. A few months. That wasn't much to go on. And no one seemed to know much about his life outside of work. He didn't talk about himself, didn't share personal details. It was as though he existed only in the confines of the diner, a shadow with no past and no future. Her frustration grew with every dead end she hit. It wasn't just curiosity driving her anymore, it was a need, an almost desperate hunger for the truth. Because deep down, she knew that whatever he was hiding, it mattered. One evening, as she sat in her car outside the diner, she caught a glimpse of him leaving through the back door. He was out of his uniform, dressed casually in a jacket and jeans, but his posture was the same, straight, confident, unhurried. He didn't notice her as he walked down the alley and turned the corner, disappearing into the shadows. Without thinking, she started her car and followed at a distance. She wasn't sure what she expected to find, but she couldn't stop herself. Her heart raced as she tailed him through the quiet streets, keeping just far enough behind to avoid detection. He walked with purpose, his steps steady and deliberate. Eventually, he turned into a small neighborhood park. She parked her car and followed on foot, her breath visible in the cool night air. The park was nearly empty, the only sounds the faint rustle of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. He stopped near a bench and sat down, his gaze fixed on the horizon. For a moment, she hesitated. What was she doing? Why couldn't she just let this go? But the pull was too strong. She had to know. Taking a deep breath, she approached him slowly. He didn't look surprised when he saw her, though his expression shifted ever so slightly, like he'd been waiting for this moment. You're persistent, he said quietly. She crossed her arms, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. You're not just a waiter. He looked at her for a long moment, his face unreadable. No, he said finally. I'm not. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. But before she could press him further, he added, Are you sure you're ready for the answers you're looking for? Her pulse quickened. I don't care if I'm ready, she said. I need to know. His gaze didn't waver, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes that made her stomach turn, a depth of knowledge, of understanding, that felt almost otherworldly. The truth has consequences, he said softly. Are you prepared to face them? The question sent a chill down her spine, but she refused to back down. I am. He held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. All right, he said. But once you step into this, there's no turning back. Her breath caught in her throat. For the first time, she wondered if she'd gotten in over her head. But it was too late to stop now. She'd already taken the first step, and there was no undoing it. As he leaned forward, lowering his voice to a near whisper, he said something that made her blood run cold. Something that would unravel everything she thought she knew about her life and about him. Her entire body went cold as his words settled into the quiet night air. He didn't raise his voice, didn't break the steady calm that seemed to follow him like a shadow, but the meaning behind what he said was undeniable. She felt a rush of confusion, fear, and disbelief all at once. For a moment she stood there, unable to respond, her mind racing to process what she had just heard. What? What do you mean? She finally managed, her voice trembling despite her attempt to stay composed. He leaned back slightly, his gaze unwavering. You've been searching for answers, he said, but some truths aren't what you think they are. Sometimes they're more complicated. Her breathing quickened. She wanted to demand an explanation, to force him to spell it out, but there was something about the way he looked at her that stopped her. It was as if he knew the impact his words would have, and he was waiting for her to decide if she truly wanted to hear more. I don't understand, she said finally, her voice almost a whisper. What does this have to do with me? He glanced away, his jaw tightening as if weighing his next words carefully. It's not just about you, he said, his tone heavy with meaning. It's about the things you've forgotten. The things you've chosen to leave behind. Her mind reeled. What was he talking about? Forgotten things? She opened her mouth to question him further, but before she could, a rustling sound behind them made her spin around. The park was still, the dim streetlights casting long shadows across the empty benches and walkways. But for a split second, she thought she saw movement of figures slipping into the darkness just beyond the trees. When she turned back, he was watching her, his expression unreadable. You're not the only one asking questions, he said. And some people don't want the answers to come out. Her pulse raced. Who? What do you mean? He shook his head, his calm demeanor finally cracking just a little. I can't explain everything here, he said. Not yet. But you need to trust me when I say this, you're in the middle of something bigger than you realize. And it's not safe for either of us to stay here. Panic bubbled up in her chest. She wanted to argue, to demand that he tell her everything now, but there was a gravity in his voice that made her stop. Against her better judgment, she nodded. Fine, she said, her voice tight. But you owe me answers. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he stood, his movements deliberate and measured. Come on, he said. We need to leave. She followed him out of the park, her heart pounding with every step. They walked in silence, his pace steady but purposeful. She kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone following them, but the streets were empty. Still, the feeling of being watched clung to her, an invisible weight pressing down on her shoulders. They reached her car, and he hesitated for a moment before opening the passenger door. Drive, he said. I'll tell you where to go. She hesitated, her hand on the steering wheel. Where are we going? To a place where we can talk, he said simply. The cryptic response frustrated her, but she started the car anyway. As she pulled away from the curb, the city lights blurred past them, the hum of the engine the only sound between them. He gave her directions in short, clipped sentences, his gaze focused out the window. She tried to read his expression, to glean anything that might give her a hint of what was going on, but his face was a mask. Finally, they arrived at a small, nondescript building on the outskirts of town. The windows were dark, and the parking lot was nearly empty. He gestured for her to park, and they stepped out into the cool night air. "This way," he said, leading her toward a side entrance. Her nerves were stretched to their limit as they entered the building. The hallway was dimly lit, the faint hum of fluorescent lights echoing in the quiet. He led her to a room at the end of the hall and opened the door, motioning for her to step inside. The room was sparse, with only a table and a few chairs. He closed the door behind them and sat down, gesturing for her to do the same. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was thick, heavy with unspoken tension. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. "What is this place?" she asked. "And why are we here?" "This is a safe space," he said. "No one will find us here. We can talk freely." She leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "Then start talking. Who are you? And what does this have to do with me?" He met her gaze, his expression serious. "You're looking for a simple answer," he said, "but there isn't one. The truth is complicated. It's tied to things you've forgotten or maybe things you've chosen to ignore." Her frustration boiled over. "Stop talking in riddles. Just tell me what's going on." For the first time, his calm facade cracked completely. "All right," he said, his voice sharp. "You want the truth? Here it is, you and we've crossed paths before. But not in the way you think. And the reason you don't remember is because someone made sure you wouldn't." She stared at him, her mind struggling to process his words. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm saying," he continued, "that your life isn't what you think it is. And neither is mine. We're both connected to something much bigger, something that's been hidden from you. And the people behind it? They don't want you to know." Her heart pounded in her chest as the weight of his words sank in. She wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but deep down, she knew he wasn't. There was a part of her, a small, nagging voice in the back of her mind that had always felt like something was missing, like there was a piece of her life she couldn't quite remember. As she sat there, the walls of the room seemed to close in around her. She was on the edge of something monumental, a truth that would change everything. But what that truth was, she couldn't yet see. And as much as she wanted to, she couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread that came with it. The room felt like it was shrinking, the air thick with tension. She leaned back in her chair, trying to steady her breathing, but her thoughts were spinning out of control. The waiter, or whoever he really was, watched her carefully, his calm gaze betraying no emotion. She didn't know whether to be furious with him for withholding answers or terrified of what those answers might reveal. "You're saying someone erased parts of my life?" she asked finally, her voice barely audible. "Not erased," he said, leaning forward. "Buried. They're still there, but you've been conditioned not to look for them. And the more you dig, the more dangerous it becomes." She shook her head, overwhelmed. "This is insane. Why would anyone do that? Who would care enough about me to go through that kind of trouble?" He hesitated, as though weighing how much to tell her. "It's not just about you," he said carefully. "You're part of a bigger picture. A chain of events that started long before either of us knew what was happening." She narrowed her eyes. "You're still not giving me a straight answer. What's the bigger picture? What chain of events?" He exhaled slowly, his calm exterior finally showing a crack. "It's not that simple," he said. "There are people who have been pulling strings for a long time, shaping lives, rewriting histories, erasing connections. They do it to protect their secrets, to keep control. And you?" He paused, his expression unreadable. "You're tied to one of those secrets." Her stomach dropped. "What kind of secret?" Before he could answer, there was a sudden noise in the hallway outside the room, a faint scuffling sound, like someone trying to move quietly but failing. They both froze. His eyes darted to the door, his entire demeanor shifting in an instant. The calm, measured man she'd been speaking to was gone, replaced by someone sharp, alert, and ready to act. "Did you tell anyone you were coming here?" he asked in a low, urgent voice. "No," she whispered, her pulse quickening. "Why?" He stood and moved toward the door, motioning for her to stay seated. "Because someone just found us." Her heart pounded as he pressed his ear to the door, listening intently. The sound came again, closer this time, a soft thud, like a footstep. Without warning, he turned to her, his expression deadly serious. "We have to leave. Now." She didn't argue. Grabbing her bag, she followed him as he eased the door open, peering out into the dim hallway. It was empty, but the tension in his posture told her he didn't trust what he saw. He gestured for her to stay close as they stepped into the hall, their footsteps muffled against the tile floor. They had almost reached the exit when a shadow moved at the far end of the hallway. She barely had time to register it before he grabbed her arm and pulled her into a side room, shutting the door quietly behind them. Her heart was racing so fast she thought it might burst. "Who's out there?" she whispered, her voice shaking. He didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out his phone and quickly typed something before slipping it back into his pocket. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the faint sound of footsteps approaching. Whoever was out there, they weren't in a hurry. It was as if they knew exactly where to look. "What's going on?" she demanded, her fear giving way to frustration. "Who are these people?" He finally turned to her, his expression grim. "They're the ones who don't want you to know the truth. And if they find us, they'll do whatever it takes to make sure you don't." Her blood ran cold. "You're saying they'll..." He cut her off. "Yes. Which is why we need to stay quiet." The footsteps grew louder, closer. She held her breath, every muscle in her body tense. The doorknob rattled, and for a horrifying moment she thought whoever was out there was going to come in. But then the footsteps continued past the door, fading into the distance. He waited a few seconds before opening the door a crack and peering out. "They're gone," he said, though his voice was still tight. "But they'll be back. We need to get out of here." As they made their way through the building, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound felt amplified. By the time they reached the exit, she was nearly shaking with fear. Once they were outside, he led her to his car, a plain, unremarkable sedan parked a few blocks away. "Get in," he said, unlocking the doors. She hesitated. "Why should I trust you? You keep talking about danger, but you won't tell me what's really going on. How do I know you're not part of this?" He met her gaze, his expression softer than she expected. "Because if I were, you wouldn't have made it this far." Something in his tone convinced her, and she climbed into the passenger seat. As they drove through the quiet streets, her mind raced with questions. Who were the people chasing them? What kind of secret could possibly warrant this level of danger? Finally, she broke the silence. "You said I was connected to some kind of bigger picture. What did you mean by that?" He glanced at her, his face illuminated by the passing streetlights. "You're not just a random person," he said. "You're part of a plan, one that's been in motion for a long time. But somewhere along the way, you slipped through the cracks. You weren't supposed to remember any of this." Her heart sank. "Remember what?" He hesitated. "That's the second thing you need to know. This isn't just about the past. It's about the future and the role you're meant to play in it." The weight of his words hit her like a punch to the gut. She felt like she was teetering on the edge of a cliff, staring into the unknown. And for the first time, she wondered if she truly wanted to know what lay beyond. The silence in the car was unbearable. She couldn't stop staring at him, trying to piece together everything he'd said, trying to make sense of a reality that felt like it was crumbling around her. His words played over and over in her mind you weren't supposed to remember. What did that even mean? How could her own life, her own memories, be so carefully controlled without her even knowing? The quiet hum of the engine filled the space as they sped down the dark road, but she finally couldn't hold back anymore. If I'm part of some plan, she said, her voice trembling, then what's my role? What am I supposed to do? He tightened his grip on the wheel, his jaw clenched. Your role isn't what they expected it to be anymore, he said. That's why they're after you. Because you could undo everything they've worked for. She turned toward him, her frustration and fear boiling over. You keep saying they. Who are they? What do they want from me? His expression was grim, his eyes locked on the road ahead. They're the ones who created the lie you've been living, he said. An organization so powerful, most people don't even know they exist. They control information, manipulate lives, shape history to their advantage. And you're the one piece of their puzzle that doesn't fit. She felt the weight of his words settle over her, heavy and suffocating. Why me? She asked, her voice cracking. What makes me so important? He hesitated, and she could tell he was struggling with how much to reveal. Finally, he said, because you're not who you think you are. Her breath caught. What are you talking about? He glanced at her briefly before returning his focus to the road. Your identity, your memories, even your family, it's all been orchestrated. But there's something they couldn't erase, something buried deep in your past that ties you to everything they're trying to protect. You have information they can't afford to let you remember. Her mind reeled. I don't understand. What kind of information? Before he could answer, headlights appeared in the rearview mirror, blinding and relentless. He tensed immediately, his calm exterior cracking. They've found us. Her stomach dropped as the car behind them sped up, closing the distance. What do we do? She asked, panic rising in her chest. Hold on, he said, his voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around them. He slammed his foot on the accelerator, the car lurching forward as they raced down the empty highway. The other vehicle followed, its engine roaring as it matched their speed. She clutched the edge of her seat, her heart pounding in her ears. The road twisted and turned, the darkness swallowing everything around them, but the pursuing car didn't back off. They're not going to stop, she shouted. They don't need to, he said grimly. They just need to corner us. A sharp turn appeared ahead, and he took it without hesitation, the tires screeching against the pavement. The pursuing car followed, but he wasn't slowing down. He seemed to know exactly where he was going, every turn and curve of the road etched into his mind. Finally, they came to a narrow, winding road that led into the woods. He swerved onto it, the headlights of the other cars still blinding behind them. The forest closed in around them, the trees casting long, jagged shadows across the road. It felt like they were driving straight into the heart of the unknown. Then, suddenly, he slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop in a small clearing. She looked at him in confusion and fear. What are you doing? They're right behind us. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. This is where it ends. Before she could respond, the other car screeched to a halt behind them, and several figures emerged, their silhouettes dark and menacing in the dim light. He stepped out of the car, motioning for her to stay inside. But she couldn't just sit there. Her fear was quickly overtaken by a desperate need for answers. She opened the door and stepped out, her legs shaking beneath her. The figures approached, their movements calculated and precise. One of them stepped forward, a tall man with an air of authority that sent a chill down her spine. You've gone too far, the man said, his voice cold and clipped. This ends now. The waiter or whoever he really was stood his ground. She deserves to know the truth, he said. You can't keep it from her forever. The man's gaze shifted to her, and for a moment, she felt like he could see straight through her. You have no idea what you're involved in, he said. Turn around now, and we'll let you walk away. Her heart pounded as she looked between the two men. She wanted to walk away, to escape this nightmare. But she couldn't. Not without answers. No, she said, her voice trembling but firm. I'm not going anywhere until I know what's going on. The tall man's expression darkened. You've made your choice. Before she could react, he signaled to the others, and they began to close in. But just as they reached her, the waiter pulled something from his pocket, a small device that emitted a blinding light. She shielded her eyes, and when the light faded, the figures were gone. The clearing was silent once again. She turned to him, her mind racing. What just happened? Who were they? They're not gone, he said, his voice heavy. They're just regrouping. But we've bought ourselves a little time. Her knees felt weak, and she leaned against the car for support. I can't keep doing this, she said, her voice breaking. I need to know the truth. All of it. He hesitated, then finally nodded. All right, he said. It's time. But before he could say another word, the small device in his hand began to beep rapidly. His face went pale, and for the first time, she saw genuine fear in his eyes. They're coming, he said. And this time, they're bringing everything they've got. The device's rapid beeping seemed to echo in her ears, amplifying the already unbearable tension in the clearing. She could barely process his words before the forest lit up with the sound of distant engines approaching. The branches overhead swayed, shadows dancing wildly on the ground as beams of light cut through the trees. Whoever was coming this time, they weren't bothering with subtlety. What do we do now? She asked, panic rising in her chest. He glanced at her, his jaw tight. We stick to the plan, he said, though his voice betrayed a flicker of doubt. But first, I need you to trust me. Her heart pounded as she searched his face. The desperation there was clear, but so was something else, a quiet determination that made her believe, against all odds, that he wasn't leading her into danger blindly. She nodded, her hands trembling. What's the plan? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he handed her the small device, which had now stopped beeping but continued to blink with a faint, rhythmic light. Hold on to this, he said. Whatever happens, don't let them get it. She stared at the device in her palm, its smooth surface cool against her skin. What is it? Proof, he said. Of everything they've tried to hide. Before she could ask more, the sound of vehicles came to a sudden halt, replaced by the crunch of heavy boots on gravel. They were here. He turned to her one last time, his expression solemn. Stay out of sight, he said. And no matter what you see or hear, don't come out. Without waiting for a response, he moved toward the center of the clearing, placing himself between her and the oncoming threat. She ducked behind a cluster of thick bushes, her heart hammering as she clutched the device tightly. She couldn't see much from her hiding spot, but she could hear them, dozens of voices speaking in low, clipped tones, the hum of radios, the unmistakable tension of people preparing for a confrontation. Then came the voice she recognized, the tall man from earlier. You should have walked away when you had the chance, he said, his tone cold and commanding. Funny, the waiter replied, his voice calm but edged with defiance. I was about to say the same thing to you. The tall man laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. You're outnumbered. Outmatched. And you're still clinging to some fantasy that she'll ever know the truth. You can't save her. You can't even save yourself. I don't need to save myself, the waiter said. I just need to make sure she's free. The weight of his words hit her like a punch to the chest. Free? From what? From whom? She crouched lower, straining to hear as the exchange grew heated. The tall man barked orders, and the sound of weapons being readied filled the air. She felt a cold wave of fear wash over her. This wasn't just about secrets or control. This was life or death. Before she could process what was happening, a sudden burst of light and sound erupted from the clearing. She flinched, covering her ears as the ground seemed to vibrate beneath her. When the noise subsided, she peeked through the branches and saw chaos figures scattered, smoke curling through the air, and the waiter standing his ground against impossible odds. He moved with precision, evading the figures who tried to close in on him, using the terrain to his advantage. But it was clear he couldn't hold them off forever. She wanted to run to him, to do something, anything to help, but his words echoed in her mind, "Don't come out." As the chaos unfolded, she realized the device in her hand was still blinking, the light growing faster and brighter. She stared at it, her heart racing. Was this part of the plan? What was she supposed to do with it? The answer came sooner than she expected. One of the figures, dressed in dark tactical gear, broke away from the others and began scanning the area with a flashlight. The beam of light swept dangerously close to her hiding spot, and she froze, holding her breath. The figure paused, their movements deliberate, as though they could sense her presence. She clenched the device tighter, her mind racing. She had no idea what it contained or why it was so important, but she knew one thing: she couldn't let them have it. The figure took a step closer, their flashlight cutting through the darkness. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she weighed her options. She could stay hidden and hope they didn't find her, or she could run and risk drawing attention to herself and the device. Before she could decide, a deafening roar shattered the silence. She whipped her head around to see a massive burst of energy erupting from the center of the clearing. The waiter had activated something, a last-ditch effort to turn the tide. The light was blinding, the sound almost unbearable, and when it finally subsided, the clearing was empty. The figures, the tall man, even the waiter, they were all gone. Her breath caught in her throat as she stepped out from her hiding spot, clutching the device like a lifeline. The air was thick with smoke, the ground littered with debris. She called out his name, her voice trembling, but there was no response. He was gone. For a moment, she stood there in stunned silence, the weight of everything crashing down on her. She was alone, holding the one thing they had all been fighting over. The device blinked steadily in her hand, its soft light almost mocking in its simplicity. Whatever it contained, it was now her responsibility. She didn't know how long she stood there, trying to make sense of what had happened. But eventually, the sound of distant sirens pulled her back to reality. She had to move. She had to get away before they came back or before someone else found her. As she made her way out of the woods, her mind raced with questions. Who were these people? What had the waiter sacrificed himself for? And what was she supposed to do now? The answers felt just out of reach, buried beneath layers of secrets and lies. But one thing was clear: her life would never be the same. In the weeks that followed, she tried to return to some semblance of normalcy, but the device remained a constant reminder of everything she'd lost and everything she still didn't understand. She kept it hidden, afraid of what might happen if it fell into the wrong hands. But she couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just proof of some shadowy organization's misdeeds. It was a key, one that could unlock the truth about her past and her place in the world. One night, as she sat alone in her apartment, the device began to blink again, its rhythm faster and more urgent than before. She stared at it, her heart pounding. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. With trembling hands, she activated the device. A soft hum filled the room, and then a voice spoke, his voice. "If you're hearing this," he said, "it means I didn't make it. But you did. And that means there's still hope." Tears filled her eyes as his message played on, explaining everything he hadn't been able to tell her in person. The organization, the secrets, the lies, all of it was connected to her in ways she never could have imagined. But more importantly, he gave her a choice: to walk away and live her life, or to use the device to expose the truth and fight back. As the message ended, she sat in silence, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She didn't know if she had the strength to take on something so big, but she also couldn't ignore everything she'd learned and everything he'd sacrificed for her. In the end, she knew there was only one choice she could make. Taking a deep breath, she activated the device's final command. The screen lit up with a series of coordinates, and as she stared at them, a sense of purpose began to replace her fear. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about something much bigger. And for the first time, she felt ready to face it. The waiter nodded and stepped away, but as he walked back toward the counter, he could feel her eyes following him. There was something almost piercing about her gaze now, as though she were trying to figure something out. And then, just as he reached the counter, she called out again. "Wait," she said, her voice sharper this time. The entire diner seemed to hold its breath as the waiter turned back toward her, his expression calm but curious. "Yes, ma'am?" he asked, his tone steady. She stared at him for a long moment, her eyes narrowing slightly. The room was silent now, everyone's attention drawn to the exchange. Finally, she spoke, her voice low but firm. "Do I know you?" she asked, the words hanging heavily in the air. The waiter tilted his head slightly, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I'm not sure, ma'am," he said. "Do you?" And just like that, the tension in the room shifted. Something unspoken passed between them, a sense that there was more to this story than anyone could see. The woman's expression flickered again, this time with something closer to unease. She opened her mouth to say something, but the words didn't come. The diner remained silent, every patron frozen in place, waiting to see what would happen next. But the waiter didn't wait for her response. With a calm, knowing smile, he turned and walked back toward the kitchen, leaving her and everyone else in the room speechless. Little did she know, the truth about his identity would turn her world upside down.